A lone hiker was trapped in an abandoned mountain cabin. What he found inside. "You need to turn back, Michael. The barometer is dropping too fast. It's a death trap up there." The voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the shrieking wind. "I'm already past the tree line," Michael yelled into the receiver, his lips numb and bleeding from the biting cold. "I can't see 5 feet in front of me. If I stop moving, I'll freeze. Find shelter. There's an old miner's cabin on the North Ridge. If you don't find it, you won't survive the night." The radio died, leaving only the hiss of static. The whiteout swallowed the world. Michael was completely alone, blind in a sea of swirling ice, searching for a ghost of a cabin that was his only hope. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It had become a living, predatory entity that clawed at Michael's clothing and sank its teeth deep into his bones. Every step forward was a monumental negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. The wind howled with a deafening guttural roar, sweeping violently across the jagged granite face of the mountain. It whipped the falling snow into horizontal sheets of ice that pelted his goggles like buckshot, rendering the landscape a disorienting, featureless void of blinding white. He was entirely disconnected from the earth, adrift in an ocean of freezing static. The radio clipped to his harness remained dead, a silent testament to his profound isolation. He had ignored the warnings at the ranger station. He had ignored the dark, bruising clouds gathering ominously at the summit. He had come to this specific peak to conquer it, to wrestle his own lingering demons to the ground. And now, the mountain was demanding his life in return for his sheer, unadulterated hubris. His breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps, each inhalation searing his lungs as if he were breathing in finely crushed glass. Every exhale was instantly snatched away by the gale, his breath freezing onto his own face, welding his balaclava to his beard in a mask of rigid ice. The thick layers of high-altitude thermal gear he wore, garments rated for Everest base camps, had long since surrendered to the plummeting sub-zero temperatures, the wind cutting through the synthetic fibers as if they were made of sheer silk. He could no longer feel his toes. They had transitioned from a screaming, burning ache to a terrifying, deadened absence. His fingers, encased in heavy Gore-Tex gloves, felt like useless, frozen blocks of wood, entirely incapable of unbuckling a carabiner or gripping an ice axe properly. He knew the physiological timeline of hypothermia intimately, having studied the grim medical journals before attempting this ascent. He knew that the violent, uncontrollable shivering currently racking his core, a primitive, desperate attempt by his muscles to generate friction, would soon cease. It would be replaced by a dangerous, lethargic warmth, a toxic flush of blood to the skin's surface, the final, deceptive comfort the dying brain offered just before the heart succumbed to ventricular fibrillation and simply stopped beating. He could already feel the edges of that warmth creeping into his peripheral nervous system, a siren song urging him to surrender. He forced his heavy, snow-caked boots forward, leaning his entire body weight at a grotesque 45-degree angle against the gale, just to remain upright. Every muscle fiber tore and complained. He had to find the North Ridge. He had to find the phantom cabin the dispatcher had mentioned in those final, desperate seconds of transmission, even though a dark, cynical part of his mind insisted the cabin was nothing more than a myth, a localized legend meant to give dying men false hope. Hours seemed to stretch into an abstract eternity. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the agonizing rhythm of his boots crunching against the ice. Hallucinations born of exhaustion and oxygen deprivation began to flicker at the edges of his vision. He saw dark, shadowy figures standing just beyond the veil of snow, only to realize they were nothing more than jagged outcrops of rock. He heard faint whispers beneath the roaring wind, voices calling his name, urging him to lie down in the soft, inviting snow and rest. "Just close your eyes for a minute," the mountain seemed to whisper. "Just 1 minute." Michael stumbled, his boot catching on a hidden fissure beneath the powder. He pitched forward, crashing heavily into the snowbank. The impact knocked the precious wind from his lungs. For a long, terrifying moment, he didn't want to get up. The snow beneath him felt incredibly soft, almost warm. The violent shivering began to subside, just as the textbooks warned. A heavy, dark blanket of exhaustion threatened to pull him under. But a sudden, sharp memory pierced the fog in his mind, the memory of why he was here. He was here to prove he was stronger than the wilderness that had broken his family. With a primal, guttural cry, He planted his ice axe into the frozen earth and dragged himself back to his feet, refusing to become another statistic on this cursed peak. He staggered forward, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. 10 steps, 20, and then a shadow materialized in the blinding whiteout. It was faint at first, perfectly rectangular, an unnatural geometric shape defying the chaotic curvature of the mountain. He pushed toward it, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. As he drew closer, the shadow resolved into solid wood and stone. It was a cabin, small, weathered, and half buried beneath a massive snowdrift. But it was real. It was a tangible, physical sanctuary, defying the violent storm. Michael practically threw himself against the heavy timber door. It was frozen shut, the hinges thick with ancient ice. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of his throat. He slammed his shoulder against the wood once, twice, 3 times, feeling the brutal impact rattle his teeth. With a loud, agonizing crack, the ice seal broke, and the door gave way. He fell forward, spilling onto the dusty wooden floorboards inside as the door slammed shut violently behind him, instantly cutting off the shrieking roar of the wind. He lay there in the absolute pitch-black darkness, his chest heaving, listening to the muffled fury of the storm battering the thick exterior walls. He was alive. He had made it. But as his eyes slowly began to adjust to the gloom, the faint, gray light filtering through a single, frost-caked window revealed something that immediately made the hair on his arm stand up. The cabin was not the rotting, abandoned miner's ruin he had expected. The wooden floor was cleanly swept. A neat, towering stack of dry firewood sat perfectly arranged beside a heavy cast-iron stove, and sitting squarely in the middle of a sturdy, hand-hewn table was a box of matches, placed perfectly beside a solitary, unlit oil lantern. Someone had been here. Someone was expecting company. The silence inside the cabin was heavy and absolute, standing in stark, surreal contrast to the violent, screaming chaos tearing across the mountain outside. Michael slowly pushed himself up from the rough-hewn floorboards, every muscle in his exhausted body screaming in protest. The immediate, terrifying danger of the whiteout had passed, but the bone-deep, marrow-chilling cold remained. He knew he had only a few precious minutes before his core temperature dropped past the point of no return. His hands, entirely numb and clumsy in their thick gloves, fumbled frantically as he stripped the wet gear from his trembling body. He stumbled toward the cast-iron stove sitting stoically in the corner. His breath plumed in the freezing air as he grabbed the box of matches from the table. It took him 4 agonizing attempts to strike a match, his fingers refusing to articulate properly. Finally, a small, brilliant yellow flame flared to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the dusty timber walls. He lit the oil lantern first, bathing the small room in a warm, amber glow, then turned his attention to the stove. The firewood was miraculously dry, layered meticulously with pine needles and perfectly shaved kindling. It caught fire almost immediately, the dry wood crackling and popping like miniature fireworks. As the first waves of radiant heat began to emanate from the iron belly of the stove, Michael collapsed onto a small wooden chair, pulling his knees to his chest. The process of thawing out was excruciating. As the blood violently forced its way back into his half-frozen capillaries, his hands and feet felt as though they were being repeatedly pierced by thousands of microscopic, red-hot needles. He gritted his teeth, biting back a groan of pure agony, rocking back and forth until the intense, burning pain slowly subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. When he finally felt stable enough to stand, he began to slowly inspect his accidental sanctuary. The cabin was small, perhaps no larger than 20 by 20 feet, but it was incredibly well fortified. The walls were constructed of massive, interlocking timber logs, chinked tightly with hardened clay and thick moss to keep the wind at bay. The single window was small and covered with a heavy secondary layer of thick plexiglass, but it was the meticulous organization of the room that truly captivated him. On a sturdy set of shelves built into the far wall, there were dozens of heavy glass jars filled with dried beans, rice, and oats. There were thick, sealed plastic bins containing medical supplies, heavy wool blankets, and even spare winter clothing. This wasn't merely a forgotten shelter. It was a fully stocked, actively maintained survival outpost. Michael moved back to the heavy wooden table in the center of the room. Beside the lantern lay a thick, leather-bound book. Its cover was deeply weathered, scarred by time and the elements, with the single word ledger branded into the hide. Drawn by an overwhelming sense of curiosity, he reached out and opened it. The thick, yellowed pages were absolutely filled with handwriting. Different inks, different penmanships, different languages. It was a guestbook, but not for vacationers. It was a registry of the desperate. He read the first entry he landed on, dated 3 years prior. Got caught in the sudden November whiteout. Lost my partner on the ridge. I was going to freeze. Found this place by a miracle. To the guardian who leaves this wood and food, you saved my life. I will never forget you. Michael turned the page, the dry paper rasping loudly in the quiet cabin. There were dozens of entries just like it. Hikers, climbers, and wayward travelers who had been caught in the mountain's deadly embrace, all finding salvation within these 4 wooden walls. They all referred to the mysterious benefactor simply as the Guardian. As Michael read through the harrowing accounts of near-death experiences and profound gratitude, he noticed a second set of handwriting interspersed between the survivors' frantic scribbles. It was elegant, precise, and distinctly masculine. It was the Guardian's own log. He traced his fingers over the dark, meticulous ink. The Guardian wrote exclusively about the maintenance of the cabin, the changing patterns of the brutal weather, and the philosophical, almost spiritual nature of the mountain itself. The mountain does not harbor malice. One entry read, dated 5 years ago. It simply demands absolute respect. I chop the wood not to conquer the winter, but to offer a small negotiation with it. We cannot defeat the cold. We can only hope to endure it. Michael stared at the words, a strange, electric chill running down his spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature. There was something deeply, unsettlingly familiar about the cadence of the sentences, the specific choice of vocabulary, the philosophical framing of man versus nature. It was like hearing a song from your distant childhood played on an out-of-tune piano, recognizable, yet distorted by time. He leaned closer to the lantern light, examining the specific, deliberate way the author crossed his T8s with a harsh, descending slash, and the way the G's looped wide at the bottom. His heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew this handwriting. He had spent his entire teenage years staring at it on birthday cards that arrived late, and letters he had refused to open. It couldn't be. The sheer impossibility of it made the room spin. The howling of the blizzard outside had faded into a dull, background roar, entirely eclipsed by the deafening silence roaring inside Michael's own head. He sat absolutely paralyzed in the wooden chair, the heavy leather ledger sitting open before him like a live explosive. The amber light from the oil lantern flickered across his pale face, casting deep, erratic shadows across the room. He frantically flipped through the pages, pulling the book closer, his eyes scanning the elegant, precise script with desperate, frantic urgency. He was searching for any detail, any shred of concrete evidence to disprove the impossible theory forming in his mind. He found an entry dated nearly 15 years ago, near the very beginning of the ledger. The ink was faded to a dull, rusty brown, but the words struck Michael with the physical force of a sledgehammer. I have walked away from everything. The entry read, the handwriting slightly more erratic, betraying a deep, underlying emotional tremor. The world below is a place of mirrors, constantly reflecting the man I failed to be, the husband I couldn't be, the father I stopped being. The accident was my fault. I was driving. I looked away. That split second of negligence shattered my family forever. They look at me and see only the trauma. I cannot bear the weight of their grief, so I have removed the cause of it. I will remain here, in the high silence. Perhaps if I can save the lives of strangers, the universe will forgive me for nearly taking the lives of the only 2 people I ever loved. Michael's breath hitched violently in his throat. He pushed the book away, his hands trembling so uncontrollably he knocked his empty metal canteen onto the floor with a loud clatter. The Guardian was Thomas, his father, the man who had walked out the front door on a rainy Tuesday morning 15 years ago and simply vanished off the face of the earth. The police had assumed he had succumbed to the elements, an apparent suicide on the very mountain ranges he used to conquer. Michael's mother had never truly recovered, and Michael had spent his entire adult life nursing a burning, acidic hatred for the man who had selfishly abandoned them because things had gotten too difficult. But the narrative was wrong. The hidden truth, laid bare in faded ink on yellowed paper, completely shattered the reality Michael had built his life upon. Thomas hadn't left out of apathy or cowardice. He had exiled himself out of an unbearable, suffocating guilt. He had built this sanctuary, carrying heavy timber and supplies up a treacherous mountain pass, enduring freezing winters in absolute isolation, all as a desperate, lifelong act of penance. A manic, desperate energy suddenly seized Michael. If this was his father's cabin, there had to be more. He grabbed the lantern and began to frantically tear the small room apart. He searched the shelves, pushing aside heavy glass jars of rice and oats. He felt beneath the rough mattress of the small cot in the corner. He ran his hands desperately along the timber walls, searching for a loose board, a hidden compartment, anything. Finally, near the back of the cabin, beneath a stack of heavy wool blankets, his fingers caught the edge of a floorboard that gave way slightly under his weight. He pried the wooden board up, the rusty nails screaming in high-pitched protest as they were forced from the timber they had gripped for over a decade. In the small, dark hollow beneath, nestled in a bed of dry moss to prevent moisture rot, sat a tarnished, rectangular tin box. It looked like an old biscuit tin, the kind his grandmother used to keep sewing supplies in, its painted lid completely scoured away by time and cold. Michael pulled it out, his hands shaking violently not from the lingering chill of the storm outside, but from a profound foundational terror of what he might find inside. The metal hinges shrieked softly, a dry, metallic gasp, as he opened it. The smell of old, dry paper and faint, stale tobacco wafted up, a scent so abruptly, violently familiar, that it nearly knocked him backward. Inside lay a single, neatly folded piece of lined yellow notebook paper and a small, fading Kodak photograph protected by a thick, clear plastic sleeve. He picked up the photograph first, his thumb trembling against the slick plastic. It was a picture of a 7-year-old boy standing proudly astride a bright red Schwinn bicycle, grinning widely through missing front teeth, a scraped knee prominent in the foreground. It was him. It was Michael, taken on the driveway of their old suburban home, a lifetime ago. The edges of the photograph beneath the plastic were worn incredibly soft, the colors at the margins completely rubbed away to white, clear and devastating evidence that it had been touched, held, and wept over thousands of times throughout the agonizingly long, lonely years. This single image had been Thomas's anchor to humanity in the desolate void of the high peaks. He slowly unfolded the piece of paper. It was a letter, heavily creased, dated just 2 days ago. "If you are reading this, Michael," the letter began, the ink fresh and dark. "Then the storm caught you, just as I feared it would when I saw your name on the ranger's registry at the base camp. I knew you would come here eventually. You always possessed my stubbornness. I wanted to come down to you, to stop you, but I knew my presence would only cause you anger. So, I spent the last 48 hours hauling enough wood to last a week, ensuring the stove was primed, and leaving the door unlocked. I cannot ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that you survive the night, stay warm, and live the long, beautiful life I nearly took from you. I will be watching the smoke from the chimney." A profound, agonizing sob tore its way out of Michael's chest. The walls of anger and resentment he had meticulously built and fortified over a decade and a half crumbled entirely into dust. He collapsed back onto the floor, clutching the letter to his chest as the tears finally came, hot and fast. A cathartic release of 15 years of misplaced hatred. The intense emotional release left Michael feeling completely hollowed out, yet strangely, incredibly light. He sat on the floor for hours, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, staring blankly into the hypnotic, orange embers of the dying fire. The letter from his father rested gently on his knee, a profound testament to a love that had spoken through action and sacrifice rather than presence. His reality had been violently inverted. The villain of his life story had secretly been its silent, suffering. He finally understood the crushing weight of the guilt that had driven Thomas to the mountain. And in that understanding, he found the miraculous, quiet grace of forgiveness. Suddenly, the tranquil silence inside the cabin was shattered. The blizzard outside, which had been reduced to a low, sustained growl, abruptly surged with terrifying, renewed violence. A colossal, concussive gust of wind slammed into the north-facing wall of the cabin like a runaway freight train. The entire structure groaned in deep, agonizing protest. Above the stove, the small, heavily fortified window violently buckled inward under the immense pressure. With a loud, sharp crack, the thick plexiglass completely shattered, sending a lethal spray of razor-sharp ice and powdered snow directly into the room. The cabin temperature plummeted instantly, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds as the shrieking, unrestrained wind invaded the sanctuary. It wasn't just cold. It was a physical assault, a kinetic wall of freezing air that knocked over the oil lantern, plunging the room into chaotic, flickering shadows before rolling off the table and shattering on the floorboards. The stove, the very beating heart of Michael's survival, hissed angrily, spewing thick, choking gray smoke into the room as a horizontal blast of snow shot violently through the open breach, directly striking the hot iron. The dying embers sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the deluge of moisture, threatening to extinguish entirely. Panic, cold, sharp, and deeply primal, seized Michael's chest in a vice grip. If the fire died, the cabin would cease to be a sanctuary. It would become a beautifully constructed wooden tomb within the hour. The latent heat would bleed out through the fractured window, and the hypothermia he had barely escaped would return to finish its grisly work. He leaped to his feet, discarding the heavy wool blanket, ignoring the immediate, biting sting of the sub-zero air against his sweat-dampened thermal shirt. He needed to plug the hole immediately, but the wind was blowing with such raw, unmitigated ferocity that it created a localized vortex inside the small room. Loose papers from the ledger whipped through the air like shrapnel. He could barely keep his eyes open against the blinding spray of fine, powdery ice, forced to squint through narrowed slits as he braced his boots against the floorboards, leaning his weight forward as if pushing against a solid, invisible wall. He spun around, desperately searching the room for a solution. His eyes fell upon the open ledger on the table. He remembered a specific entry he had read earlier, a detailed, methodical instruction written by Thomas on how to survive a structural breach. When the glass fails, the mountain will try to claim the fire, the entry had read. Do not fight the wind directly. Use the heavy canvas tarp rolled beneath the cot. Secure the top corners first, using the iron climbing pitons driven into the high logs. Then pull it taut across the frame. Michael didn't hesitate. He dove toward the cot, his hands frantically feeling beneath the wooden frame in the dark. His fingers brushed against heavy, coarse fabric. He dragged the thick canvas tarp out, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the heavy iron hammer resting beside the firewood and scrambled toward the shattered window. The wind was deafening, a physical force actively trying to push him backward. He felt the biting, agonizing cold immediately begin to numb his fingers again, but he pushed through the pain, channeling the stubborn, relentless resilience he now knew he had inherited from his father. He found the iron pitons exactly where the journal said they would be, driven deeply into the timber above the window frame. Fighting the violent, flapping canvas, he managed to hook the heavy brass grommets over the metal spikes. He threw his entire body weight against the tarp, pulling it violently downward until it covered the gaping hole, temporarily blocking the worst of the snow. Holding the canvas tight with one hand, he frantically grabbed thick roofing nails from a jar on the shelf and began hammering them furiously into the thick timber frame, sealing the breach. It took 10 agonizing minutes of brutal, exhausting labor, but the tarp held tight. The roaring wind was reduced once again to a muffled, frustrated howl. Michael collapsed back against the wall, gasping desperately for air, his muscles trembling violently. He immediately crawled back to the stove, feeding it dry pine needles and kindling, blowing gently into the ashes until the fire roared back to life, successfully casting its warm, life-saving glow back across the room. He had done it. He had saved the sanctuary. Guided entirely by the phantom hand of his father, he spent the remainder of the long, dark night tending to the fire, wrapped in the blanket, feeling a profound sense of peace he hadn't experienced since he was a child. Eventually, the howling wind outside died down, replaced by a deep, absolute stillness. The darkness inside the cabin slowly began to lift, replaced by a brilliant, pure white light creeping through the edges of the canvas tarp. Morning had broken. Michael stood up, his body stiff and aching, and slowly pushed open the heavy timber door. The storm had passed completely. The world outside was breathtakingly beautiful, a pristine, untouched ocean of glittering white snow beneath a perfectly clear, blindingly blue sky. The air was still and incredibly crisp. Michael stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep, cleansing breath. He looked out across the vast expanse of the mountain, and then, his eyes caught something on the high ridge about 200 yards above the cabin. There, Etched perfectly into the fresh, powdery snow was a single set of boot prints. They approached the edge of the ridge, paused, and then turned back toward the higher peaks, disappearing into the tree line. Thomas had been there. He had watched the chimney, just as he promised, standing vigil in the freezing storm until he was absolutely certain his son was safe. Michael didn't shout. He didn't try to follow the tracks. He simply raised his hand toward the ridge, a silent, profound gesture of gratitude, forgiveness, and absolute understanding. Michael eventually made his way down the mountain, carrying his father's journal safely tucked inside his pack. He never saw the man who had built the cabin, but he no longer needed to. The heavy resentment that had weighed him down for 15 years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, life-altering understanding. Sometimes, the people who leave us haven't stopped loving us. They are just fighting terrible battles we cannot see, in places we cannot reach, sacrificing their own peace to ensure ours. The mountain had once taken his father away, but ultimately, it was the mountain that gave him back. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to support more cinematic tales of survival, hidden truths, and the enduring power of the human spirit.